probably have some slides of Old Shinley Park first and then go on a walk. So we only can take 25 people because otherwise you can't hear well enough. So please take a look at that. Our next two speakers are Marcellus Shale next month, Professor Bain from the University of Pittsburgh. In June, and I have to say this many times, the first Tuesday in June, Dr. Freddie Fu will be here. It's a University of Pittsburgh series coming up here. Dr. Fu will be here, and he'll be traveling on the 12th, so we're going to do it on the 5th of June. And then in July, before our summer break, we're going to have Terry Necci, who started this organization a couple years before I joined and became chairman. He's in the historic preservation field, and he's going to come on back and talk about some of the things he's doing. We thought that'd be of interest. So, please we've been having great attendance, please keep coming. A couple other things. One, the Pirates lost 2-1 today, since we've got a baseball crowd tonight. You remember, some of you were here, we talked a lot about historic districts in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. I found that something interesting today from History and Landmarks. There's a move afoot, supported by the mayor, very likely to happen, that in the next few months that the 3 existing historic districts in downtown are going to be expanded, and there will also be one new one, and approximately 100 new buildings will come into the historic family in Pittsburgh. And the reason for that is the rules for the National Register are that it has to be buildings 50 years or older. And every once in a while you get a big enough batch of buildings who've come into that 50 years or older that it's worth taking a look at expanding. So that probably will be good front page news pretty soon. The last thing, Helen Wilson, wave Helen. Helen is our vice president, but getting to be a budding star author. We have an article that some of you may have seen in the Post-Gazette about the Turner Cemetery and history around here. We've made copies. Please feel free to take one. They're on the back. Very pleased tonight to have Rob Ruck, who's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, senior lecturer in history, come and talk to us about something most of us know very little about, which is black baseball in Pittsburgh. As tell us, this was one of the centers. Rob has a long pedigree, which we published in the newsletter, but in our website. But among his writings are Sandlot Season, Sport in Black Pittsburgh, The Topic of Baseball, Baseball in the Dominican Republic, Rooney, A Sporting Life, and recently released Raceball, How the Major Leagues Colonized the Black and Latin Game. And without further ado, I'll have Rob come up and speak to us.
I don't think we need a mic in here. Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming tonight. When I began graduate school in history at the University of Pittsburgh in 1975, I started to run in Shenley Park. There's a bend in the trail where you can look down across the Monongahela River, and back in 1975, you can see the Jones and Laughlin Mill on the south side. Steel is what Pittsburgh seemed to be about back then. It's what had brought many people to the city from Eastern and Southern Central Europe, out of the Black Belt of the South, out of Ireland, out of England. It defined the tempo of life. It's what gave the city its identity. And the iron and steel industry in Pittsburgh was the manufacturing epicenter of this nation as it became the most powerful economic force on the globe. Well, steel offered so much. But most of all, I think, it told the story of Pittsburgh to the world. It was what we were about. Gritty, unpretentious, productive, both as individuals and in terms of business. Well, that Jones and Laughlin mill that I could see in 1975 is long gone. I still run in Shelby Park, not as fast. But what do I see when I look at that bend across the river to the south side? It's where the University of Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Steelers have their joint football offices and facilities. And I think that captures in many ways the symbolic shift in the identity that Pittsburgh has, and the way in which people all over the globe look at us. It's hard to find steelworkers in Pittsburgh these days, but it's not hard to find athletes and fans. And that, to me, says much about the transition that we've undergone, a shift in collective identity. I've come to see sports as something that many people use as a way to tell a story about who they are. I think most of the men in this room grew up using sport as a way to come to terms with their own identity and to project a certain status, to feel they were tough enough, a man, that they could cut it, that they could compete. I think that since Title IX in 1972, we've had several generations of females grow up using sport now to tell a story about who they are. I think it's true that not just individuals use sport to tell a story about who they are, but people do it collectively. The nation of Brazil uses football. The Dominican Republic uses baseball. Kenyans use running. I think that African American culture in this country has been heavily defined and influenced by sport. And I think there are also towns and cities that use sport to tell a story about itself. And I don't think there's any city in the United States, if not in the world, that uses sport as much as Pittsburgh does to tell its story to the world. We have embraced sport at the core of our collective identity. And I think in the last 40 years, it is what people know us by. It's a more enduring image right now than steel. And the story, I think, that is projected about us and which we love to tell. It's about people who make commitment, who sacrifice, who work hard but play harder, who lose but persevere, and in the end, become the city of champions. Let me argue 3 points. First, I don't think there's a city in the United States of comparable size. So I'm going to leave away outside New York City and Chicago, which dwarf us in population. Any other city, Baltimore, Cleveland, Buffalo, Philadelphia, LA, there is no city that has the across-the-board record of achievement in 20th century sport as Pittsburgh. We're talking about the Pirates in 5 World Series, the Penguins in a couple of Stanley Cups, the Steelers with 4 Super Bowls in the 70s alone, Pitt with close to a dozen National Football League championships, the Lowendies and the Monticellos, black basketball clubs that were the national champions early in the 20th century. And in the 1930s and in the 1940s, the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays that made this city the crossroads of black baseball in the country. We've also given to sport some of its most iconic figures. Baseball in the early 20th century was personified by Honus Wagner, the ham-handed shortstop who'd scoop up the ball and dust and pebbles from his position at shortstop, first at Exposition Field and then Forbes Field, one of the 5 original inductees of the Hall of Fame. In the 30s and 40s, the iconic figures of black baseball were Cool Papa Bell flying around the base paths, Josh Gibson hitting balls further than anybody had ever seen hit before, and Satchel Paige walking the bases loaded on purpose, then telling his fielders to sit down and striking out the side. I'm sure most of you in this room can visualize Bill Mazeroski, hat in hand, floating in the air as he rounded third base to cap the 1960 World Series. Or Roberto Clemente unleashing throws from right field as the Pirates came back from a 2-game-to-none deficit against the Baltimore Orioles in 1971. And then, of course, the iconic moment in sport, with the clock all but exhausted, Franco Harris grabbing a ball before it hits the turf, rumbling into the end zone to turn what seemed to be a certain defeat into victory. A play that by nightfall had been dubbed the Immaculate Reception. And there for each of those moments, this huge cigar affixed to his lip, was Art Rooney. He played with and against Gibson and Wagner. He was in the stands for Clemente and Mazeroski. Ironically, he didn't see Franco Harris catch that ball because he was in the elevator going from the press box to the locker room to console his losing team when all of a sudden the stadium shook and he did not dare believe what had happened. Well, by the end of the 1970s, when the Mills were entering their death throes, Pittsburgh had been rechristened the City of Champions. You know who gave us that name? Howard Cosell. I will not try to quote Cosell. This came in a 2-paragraph long sentence. But he made that comment about Pittsburgh as a Renaissance city, coming back during the 1979 baseball playoffs, when he dubbed us the City of Champions. Well, with Pirates coming from behind in 71 and again in 79, Pitt winning a national championship in 76, the Steelers with their 4 Super Bowl titles, we were Titletown, USA. An identity, of course, we needed all the more because the traditional identity and the jobs, 100,000 good jobs that a single breadwinner with a union contract could support a family on, own a home and send a kid to college, we had lost. From the South Side to the pages of the New Yorker magazine, people started to talk about Pittsburgh and sport. They wondered about all these Hall of Fame quarterbacks. They wondered about the fact that there was this harmony in the clubhouse, the multinational lineup in 1971, the We Are Family Buccos of 79, Franco and Franco's Italian army. Well, we were tough, we were hardworking, we were unpretentious, all the more important at that time in terms of the identity that we crafted. Now, by then most people identified Pittsburgh sport with the city's professional teams. But here's my second point. Much of that success historically is homegrown. It came from the sandlots. It's not about people we simply lured here because we paid them millions and millions of dollars. It's about people, for the most part, who grew up here. It's about boys and girls, men and women from mill towns, from neighborhoods, on the hill in East Liberty and the like. Hannes Wagner was born in Carnegie. His father worked in the mines. Wagner went into the mines as a 12-year-old boy. He was as working class as his family. His mother died of typhoid, the big killer in Pittsburgh at the turn of the century. It's Josh Gibson, who comes here when his father leaves sharecropping in Georgia to get a job in one of Carnegie's mills after World War I. It's about Cumberland Posey Jr., who was considered the greatest black athlete in basketball in the early 20th century, and the architect of the Homestead grade, who was elected to the Hall of Fame in 2006. It's about boxing champs like Billy Conn from East Liberty, who used to live a couple of blocks from here, or Harry Greb from Garfield, or Fritzy Zivik from Lawrenceville, or Charles Burley from the Hill. And those who weren't from here originally, like Barney Dreyfus, who emigrates from Freiburg, Germany as an 18-year-old Jew to Kentucky, ends up here as the owner of the Pirates, stays here, and along with his daughter and son, own the Pirates for almost half a century. It's about Mario Lemieux, who never graduates high school, who comes here and stays here. Willie Stargell, who comes here and stays here. They become Pittsburghers. I would argue that the roots of our sporting excellence can be found on these neighborhood sandlots and gyms, where sport wasn't about money so much as about allowing people to feel good about who they are. Something you did not necessarily feel doing those shifts in the mill or in the mines. It allowed people who were not allowed to get too far educationally, politically, and culturally to shine, to be somebody, to be applauded, to show their grace and competence. You know, it's often said that baseball was the vehicle of Americanization for one immigrant generation after another. Well, I think sport was the vehicle by which many immigrant groups became Pittsburghers. Now, think of some of the greatest franchises in Pittsburgh history. Pittsburgh Steelers began on the north side, a bunch of Irish Catholic kids called the Hope Harveys. They took their name, Hope was the local firehouse they used as a locker room, and Harvey was the doctor who took care of them. They eventually become the Pittsburgh Steelers. The two clubs I'm going to talk about more today, one, the Homestead Grays, is formed by skilled black workers at the Homestead plant. While the Pittsburgh Crawfords get their name from the Crawford bathhouse, where immigrants from Europe and migrants from the South got a bath and got some help in adjusting. Now, they are part of a very rich and vibrant sporting network, one that saw hundreds of baseball and football teams play each season. There are approximately 300 to 400 baseball clubs in and around Pittsburgh each year, what we would call independent, sandlot, semi-pro, they might pass the hat. There are about 80 football teams. A good number of these teams were black. Very few were integrated. It's about the neighborhood fight clubs, the lyceums, all over. Every neighborhood had one. In the late 30s, when there were only 8 champions of the world in boxing, you had 8 classifications, only one sanctioning body. As Roy McHugh, the great sports writer, often says, Pittsburgh was a fight town. 5 of the 8 champions were grown in Pittsburgh. Now, then of course, the 30s and 40s, when we dominate black baseball. Now, what do all these people see in sport? I think it's a way to craft an identity. It's to feel good about life. Oftentimes, those identities become intertwined with nationality and racial issues. Now, I think these sandlot and local institutions mattered far more to people than did the professional clubs. In fact, if you looked at attendance, until maybe the 50s, on any given weekend, more people see these teams play than the Pirates or the Steelers. Let me talk just a bit why. Sport back then wasn't anything like it is today in terms of money. It wasn't broadcast. I mean, radio doesn't put a lot of money into it. There's no TV. There's no merchandising. There's no corporate sponsorships. No naming rights. No signage. No mega buck deals. People played to play. They were much more likely to go to a local sandlot after work in the twilight or on the weekend and play themselves, which is always the most fun. Or the best thing, if you're not playing yourself, is to be watching people you know and care for, family, workmates, friends play, than they were to go to Ford's Field, where you had to pay and you had to take off work. The sandlot was where people defined themselves. The other thing I think is, we know Pittsburgh is a fractured and divided city. Topography, class, religion, nationality, race. I would argue that the sandlots were the most level playing field in the city and region at the time. And while kids played with each other, black and white, the older they got, the more likely they were desegregated, but they did play each other at a time when African Americans are not playing in Major League Baseball and really aren't an issue in the National Football League until after World War II. So I think sport gave people something, a chance to affirm who they were, and it wasn't really about money. And I think that the fewer opportunities you have, the more likely sport is going to mean a lot to you. Yeah. I think that's why sport matters to most of us. We actually pay for the sport. We're not getting paid. But we don't love it because people are making a lot of money. We love it because of the camaraderie, that sense of collective energy it provides in the life. The third point there, I would argue that the history of sport and its legacy in this area has always been the strongest when it has been a multiracial story. And we talk a little bit about baseball to try to make that point. If a century ago baseball had little to do with commercial motives for most people, remember, even into the 50s and 60s, ball players had to get a job in the off-season. You know, it wasn't like they made mega bucks. But it was a way to become an American in the late 1800s. And the Irish and the German do that in a tremendous way by the end of the 1800s. Jews, Italians, Poles, Croats also do that. Now, baseball is played by African Americans in the North, usually by those who are better off. Those who have the time and the money to spend learning how to play this game, which you really need to devote a lot of time to develop the muscle memory that it takes. Now, in the 1870s and the 1880s, before we see this structure of baseball with the major leagues monopolizing, you had black players in what were then called the major leagues, play on different teams. In general, though, African Americans have less leisure time, less of a chance to develop their skills, and thus were not collectively as proficient. Now, amidst the racial reaction of the 1890s, the rise of social Darwinism, Plessy versus Ferguson legitimizing segregation, saying you could have separate but equal, it was always separate, never equal. At a time of lynchings, at a time when African Americans were being driven off the voting rolls throughout the South, baseball eliminates its black players from the so-called major leagues. And they will remain out of baseball for the next half century until baseball is reintegrated with Jackie Robinson in 1947. Now, given what African Americans were facing at the time, lynchings, Jim Crow, and the like, I'm not sure that not being able to play Major League Baseball was in your top 5 or your top 10 list of grievances. But I think it was important because exclusion from baseball stigmatized African Americans at a time in which baseball was being seen as the way to become American for immigrants, for white immigrants. The belief then was, if you could make it on the sandlot, you were an American. You showed your competence. Whites don't see blacks playing in the majors. They think, well, they're not good enough. They're not thinking that they were denied the opportunity, that there were exclusionist practices, that they're simply not intelligent enough, not athletic enough. Remember that 100 years ago, the default popular wisdom was that blacks were inferior, naturally inferior athletes. We've kind of flipped it today. Wrong then, wrong now. But that's a very strong viewpoint. That black fighters had weak abdominal muscles. You hit them in the stomach, they'll crumble. They lacked endurance. They lacked composure to make important decisions at the important moments in the game and the like. At any rate, African Americans thus are denied this very visible arena that's defining citizenship at that time. Now, beyond the boundary that's drawn by segregation, black America builds a baseball world of its own. And very ironically, so are Cubans and Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and Venezuelans in the Caribbean. Baseball takes hold in Cuba in the 1860s. They've got their own Cuban league 2 years after the National League forms in the United States. And the interesting thing about Cuban baseball was what we said we were, the watchword of democracy, when we weren't. When we are exclusionist and racist in our baseball, Cuban baseball is open to people of all color and all nationalities. What do these games mean? These microcultures of sport? Well, I think they take on roles that are critical in bringing communities together and establishing collective identities, and giving people the chance in sport to experience each other. I think they lend cohesion to fractured societies, and for people in the Caribbean, they provide the one arena for people in Cuba, the Dominican, who are being occupied by the United States to beat the Yankees at their own game. In the United States, the Negro Leagues, formed in 1920, become one of the first national black institutions to emerge after Reconstruction. They emerge after that great migration northward. Now, 1910, 90% of all African Americans still live south of the Mason-Dixon line. You don't have much of a chance of building any institution in the South, particularly the rural South, where 3/4 of all blacks are living. You build something up, it gets smashed. You're sharecropping. you're falling further behind in debt every year. But with this migration northward, a little bit in the 1890s, a whole lot more during World War I when jobs open up because of demands in industry and the immigrants aren't getting over, then you have the black populations in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Kansas City that can sustain a cultural institution such as a professional ball club. In 1920, Rube Foster, who originally is from Texas, was a great pitcher, became owner of a black ball club called the Chicago American Giants, brings the Kansas City Monarchs and teams in other Midwestern cities together and forms that Negro National League. It's a time of the Harlem Renaissance, of breakthroughs in jazz, of political engagement, of what they called the New Negro, the black nationalism of Marcus Garvey. That league does well, financially and athletically, but it crumbles in the late 20s. Two things killed it: the Depression, and Rube Foster, who had had this incident with some gas leaking. It basically caused him to be institutionalized, and he soon died. The league is resurrected a couple of years later in Pittsburgh on the Hill. It's the second Negro National League. And in the 30s, with Cool Papa Bell and Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and Oscar Charleston and Judy Johnson, that's 5 Hall of Famers on one club alone, the Pittsburgh Crawfords, a roster of 16. With Buck Leonard, Willie Foster, at times Gibson, Bell, Johnson, Charleston, Vic Harris on the Homestead Grays. We were the crossroads of black baseball. The only city with 2 black ball clubs. There was a ball club on the Hill, Greenleaf Field, that Gus Greenleaf built. Some of you might have known him from the Numbers, or for the Crawford Grill, the Mecca for Jazz. When the Baseball Hall of Fame finally got around to electing players from the Negro Leagues, 7 of the first 11 elected had played for either the Grays or the Crawfords or both of them. Now let me talk to you a little bit about these teams. First, the Grays. A very unusual cohort of skilled black workers forms at the Carnegie Mill in Homestead at the turn of the century. Soon we're not going to have many skilled black men in the steel industry. But these men form a club. I'm going to go through a couple of names. Formed around 1900. Murdoch Grays, the Homestead Grays, and then Cumberland Posey joins them as an outfielder in 1911. Cumberland Posey's father, Captain Posey, was the most successful African-American entrepreneur in the area. He's head of the AME Church, president of the Courier Board. He's a successful businessman. He's the Diamond Coke and Coal Company. Employs hundreds of people. His son, Cumberland Posey, grows up in Homestead, leads Homestead to a state finals in basketball. He plays ball at Penn State, at Duquesne, which was then Holy Ghost College, where he actually played under the name of Charles Cumbert, not Cumberland Posey. And the reason was he was playing semi-pro baseball and basketball. Everybody knows who this guy is. He's the most prominent black athlete in the city. He's playing under a name that everybody knows, but everybody gives him a pass because amateurism was more honored in the breach in those days. Well, Posey becomes their captain, their manager, and their owner. And he takes this team of black steelworkers and he begins to recruit to Pittsburgh great black ball players from around the country. And whenever a Negro League team passes through Pittsburgh, they play. And then they do what's called barnstorming, when you go from town to town, city to city, and playing. And they play 2 or 3 times a day, because the only money they have is the money at the gate. Well, Posey is an astute businessman. He makes the Grays a success at the box office, and he will make them probably the greatest franchise in black baseball history. The only one that could compete with us would be the Kansas City Monarchs. Now, Posey, by the way, gets elected to the Hall of Fame in 2006, when the Hall of Fame held a special committee and 18 people from the Negro Leagues in the Caribbean were brought in. The Crawfords were not part of that first wave migration. They're part of the World War I era migration. The first wave is coming from Maryland, DC, West Virginia, Delaware. The World War I era migration is coming from the Black Belt, from Georgia, from Alabama. And there's a big difference. There's a class difference. There's a rural versus urban difference in where these people are from. You know, you're coming from DC or from a town or city. It's a very different experience that you bring if you're coming from a rural part of Georgia, Alabama, or the Delta of Mississippi. There's a skin color difference. There's a difference in skill, in education, and the like. The Crawfords are from that second wave, that World War I Great Migration, of kids like Harold Tinker, who grows up on the hill from Birmingham, and his friend Neil Harris, also from Birmingham, who had 5 brothers who played baseball, including one who was a star for the Grays. Around 1925, black kids who played on 2 integrated teams at schools on the Hill decide to pool their black players, enter a city league. They had to enter a black or a white team. And they get sponsorship from the Crawford Bathhouse. They win the city championship. There's a classic photo of them posed on the steps of Carnegie Library on Wiley Avenue on the Hill. They become independent. They recruit other black players. They become known as the Little Homestead Grays. And then Harold Tinker's over on the north side one day, and he sees this 16-year-old kid playing third base. And Harold, who'd later become a preacher at Central Baptist, said, you know, this kid is fielding balls, and you know, the field is rutted and full of pebbles like he's playing on Forbes Field. And then he'd throw, and he couldn't believe his arm. And then later, this kid came to bat, and as Harold said, he hit the ball out of existence. It went up over a mountain. Nobody went after it. And after the game, he said to Josh Gibson, don't you want to play in a real ball club? Don't you want to join us on the Crawfords? And Gibson came up to Ammon Field on the Hill. And the Crawfords now had a future Hall of Famer anchoring the line. They're getting better and better. They're ready to play the Grays. Cumberland Posey, though, sees this kid. He wants him for the Grays. And Posey can offer a paycheck, which the Crawfords couldn't. So Gibson goes from the Crawfords to the Grays. The Grays, though, get somebody who in some ways is even more important than Gibson, Gus Greenlee. Greenlee came up from North Carolina during the migration, fought in a black unit in World War I. He ran liquor during Prohibition. He started to form nightclubs. And he and Woogie Harris, Teenie Harris's older brother, popularized the numbers. Gus Greenlee is a numbers baron. And he's willing to use money for the black community. I've talked to dozens of people who had gotten loans from Greenlee they never repaid. You get in trouble, you need some help, you see Gus at the Crawford Grill. And the Crawford Grill is bringing in every great jazz player, many from Pittsburgh. But Greenlee is willing to put money into making the Crawfords a legitimate Negro League team. He puts these kids on salary. He recruits Satchel Paige to town, Oscar Charleston, Cool Papa Bell, Judy Johnson. He builds Greenlee Field, the finest black-owned ballpark in the nation, on Bedford Avenue on the Hill. It's now, later, it's torn down and Bedford Dwellings is there. And the Crawfords now not only challenge the Grays, they surpass them. Their 1935 and 1936 teams are probably, well, certainly the greatest in black baseball. People compare them with the 1927 Yankees of Ruth and Gehrig. They might have been better than this club. Well, 1937, the Crawfords are torn apart by the volatile politics of a Caribbean island. The Dominican Republic was ruled in those years by Rafael Trujillo. This guy's a megalomaniac of amazing proportions. Santo Domingo in those days was called Ciudad Trujillo.
Pico Duarte was Pico Trujillo. In everybody's house, there would be a little plaque that said, "En esta casa," in this house, Trujillo es el jefe. Trujillo is the chief. In 1936, a ball club from San Pedro de Macorís beat the Santo Domingo teams, the Ciudad Trujillo teams associated with Trujillo. So what does he do? He takes the two teams in the capital, combines them. And then he's not satisfied. So he sends his emissaries to this country. They recruit 9 players from the Crawfords to come down and play for Ciudad Trujillo, including Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Sammy Bankhead, and Cool Papa Bell. Probably the greatest baseball played anywhere that summer is in the Dominican Republic. They win their championship, but the Crawfords are done. Gus will soon give up baseball, he turns to boxing. He promotes and manages John Henry Lewis, who becomes the light heavyweight champion of the world, not Joe Lewis. And Greenleaf Field is eventually torn down. Gibson, however, comes back to Pittsburgh. And now, he's on the Grays. And with Buck Leonard, the Hall of Famer, and Gibson, the Grays will win 9 Negro League championships in a row, from 1937 to 1945. Gibson, after that season, died at the age of 35. It's a little unclear. It was a brain tumor, an aneurysm. A couple months, though, before he died, Jackie Robinson was signed to a contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, let me try to talk about what these teams, I think, meant. And I think you have to put this in the context of the Great Migration. Black Pittsburgh had about 20,000 African Americans in 1900. By 1930, those numbers have almost tripled. Now, as that's happening, there is actually greater segregation going on. And what we're seeing is more or less black ghettos being formed, in which the huge influx of people is exacerbating one of the traditional problems in the city, which was a lack of good housing, but also public health issues. I mean, Pittsburgh had the highest death rates from typhoid and typhus in the nation in 1900. So living conditions are deteriorating. There aren't the schools, the playgrounds, and the like. Another problem. The North might be perceived as the promised land compared to the South, but it wasn't. There's still severe racial barriers. I mean, an African American can't become a school teacher in the city of Pittsburgh, what, Barbara, till the late 40s, 50s? But it's pretty late. I don't think there's a black councilman until Paul Jones maybe in the 50s. Now, the other thing was, I would argue that the black community was internally divided between the northern-born and the southern migrant. The northern-born, lighter-skinned, better off, better educated, who had been here for a while, considered themselves the OPs, the old Pittsburghers. And they were worried that this influx of southern, rural folks was going to cause problems and lower their status. I think, though, that baseball begins to unite this fractured community, providing common heroes, common institutions, a form of entertainment that everybody could get behind. I think it provided a bridge to white communities. I'd often give talks in areas all over western Pennsylvania about the old Negro Leagues. I used to show this documentary I made. And you have white guys, old-timers, stand up and say how proud they were to have been struck out by Satchel Paige, or to have had Josh Gibson hit a home, just being on the ball field. Now, it's not like sport erases racism and changes people's attitudes, but you really, if you play somebody and they beat you, you know they're as good or better than you are. There's a certain, I think, important lesson to be learned there. And these teams were good. The records we have show that the black teams won 60% of their games with teams made up of white major leaguers, and they play frequently in the off-season. Barnstorm. Now, black America, I think, took enormous pride in these teams. But there had been a long effort in the black community, led often by black sports writers and activists, amplified during World War II by radicals and communists fighting for integration in baseball and in other avenues of life. World War II encouraged another even bigger round of the Great Migration. It suddenly made black fans appetizing to white team owners because the black population in major league cities is soaring. And we know that World War II was a catalyst to the Civil Rights Movement. It energized black activism, from the March on Washington that never occurred, that A. Philip Randolph threatened just to get defense work desegregated, to the Pittsburgh Courier's Double V campaign, victory over fascism in Europe, over racism at home. And Branch Rickey, president of the Brooklyn Dodgers, sees the handwriting on the wall, sees the great talent in the Caribbean and in black baseball, begins scouting black players, and brings aboard a lieutenant who had successfully fought a court-martial, who had played ball at UCLA, who was a tremendous football, basketball. He won championships in swimming, in golf, in track and field. His brother Mac was a silver medalist at the 1936 Olympic Games, coming in behind Jesse Owens, and went back to Pasadena, California, and the best job he could get was as a street sweeper. But Rickey signs this Jackie Robinson. Pittsburgh Courier writes, the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations of 12 million Afro-Americans are heaped on Jackie's broad shoulders. Well, we saw the success of baseball's great experiment. We see the Dodgers finally beat the Yankees in the World Series. We see the Giants with Mays and Monty Irvin, both former Negro Leaguers, win in '54. The Braves with another former Negro Leaguer, Henry Aaron, win. We see the Pirates with Clemente, with Stargell. We see the Pirates in 1971 in September become the first team to field an all-black and Latin lineup. Black and brown faces in the World Series and the All-Star Game became commonplace. By the late 1970s, there were about 27% of all major leaguers were African American, and a disproportionate number of all-stars were. But integration came at a price. It destroyed the Negro Leagues. And with it, black ownership, black managers, black general managers, and a whole lot of jobs for some time to come. Now, something else is going on after World War II, and that's television, which is really destroying the sandlots, television and suburbanization. So that whole sandlot infrastructure is beginning to fall apart. And the black community, I think, is losing control over these important institutions that were theirs, that they control. Major League Baseball never seriously considered bringing in a black team, like the Homestead Grays and the Yankees. They never even considered the request of black baseball to bring in the black teams as a high minor league. It wouldn't have anything to do with it. They wanted the black players, like Banks and Aaron and Mays and Campanella. They wanted the paying fan. Pittsburgh Courier put it best. The Dodgers set all kinds of attendance records with Jackie Robinson. And the Courier said, Jackie's nimble, Jackie's quick, Jackie makes the turnstiles click. Well, no surprise then that on the 40th anniversary of Major League Baseball's integration, Al Campanis, the general manager of the Dodgers, is on Nightline with Ted Koppel, celebrating Jackie Robinson. And unfortunately, he makes an utter fool of himself and comes off as a racist. When he tries to answer questions about why aren't there any black managers or coaches or GMs, and he says things that basically give this essentialist, racialist kind of characterization of African Americans. It's ironic because Campanis and Jackie were friends. They were on the same minor league team together, the Montreal Club, and when Jackie wasn't allowed to fight back, Al Campanis offered to fight back for him. And when Jackie took a bunch of black players to Barnstorm at the end of the season, he brought along 2 white guys. One of them was Al Campanis. Al Campanis had 3 photos on his wall: Jackie, Roberto Clemente, and Sandy Koufax. A Jew, a Puerto Rican, and an African American. Nevertheless, Major League Baseball is embarrassed. Campanis is forced out. But as Reggie Jackson and Frank Robinson said, that was the best thing that could have happened. That embarrassment made Major League Baseball integrate the front office. It also led the Pirates to do something I have been after them to do for 5 years, which was honor the old black ball clubs, which they finally did in 1988. It was the first time a Major League club had done so, and they went far beyond what I expected. They apologized. The president of the Pirates apologized. And ever since, most clubs have these games where guys wear throwback jerseys of the Grays and the Crawfords, and kids today know about them. The Pirates have continued that. They may not be that much on the field, but they've got Legacy Square, their own little Negro League exhibit and museum down at PNC Park. But by 1987, when Campanis was on Nightline, Major League Baseball was finally beginning to do something about black front office people. There was something else going on, which was that black players were beginning to disappear. And they've largely left the game. MLB has done a pretty good job integrating the front office. But from a peak of 27% of all players being African American, it's down to under 9% today. There are 5 starting pitchers in baseball that are black. Moreover, baseball is the least favorite sport among African Americans. A sport which had done so much, not popular at all. There was a poll a couple of years ago, Gallup or Roper. I think by far it's the National Football League, then the NBA. They had numbers 40 plus. Baseball was popular in 6%. If you're interested, we can discuss why, what happened. But there's also been a demographic revolution. If African Americans are disappearing from the game, who's taking their place?
Latin American.
They now make up about 27+% of all baseball players. Almost 50% of all minor leaguers are from abroad. Dominicans. There are only 10 million Dominicans. 10% of all major leaguers are Dominican. A third of all minor leaguers. 40% of the All-Star game a couple of years ago were Latinos. 2 years ago, they give this award, the Silver Slugger, to the best hitter at every position. Latinos won half of them. If you look at the best players in the game, Robinson Cano, Pujol, A-Rod, and the like, you can see this Latinization. Now, there are problems. We can talk about that too, particularly the problems of kids who are being trafficked by Major League ball clubs and self-styled agents called Biscones in the Caribbean, where they grab these kids at 13, 14, 15 years of age, often pump them up with steroids, have them lie about their age, and make money from it. But, pretty clear the future of the game is a Caribbean game. I don't think you're ever going to see African Americans returning in baseball to the prominence that they had when baseball was meaningful, and I think when Pittsburgh was at the center of this world. Thank you. Questions? Over there.
Take the 27 Yankees and play them against the Crawfords or the Homestead Grays or combination. Who wins and why?
Yeah, good question.
You know, I know all those folks who do IT-based things have probably done that. It would have been a great series to see. Joe DiMaggio used to say that Satchel Paige was the toughest pitcher he ever faced. Now, DiMaggio is a later incarnation of the Yankees. And those Yankees were phenomenal. You know, there's an interesting thing about baseball records. What's the one baseball record that is unlikely to fall?
Cy Young.
Well, that's true.
Babe Ruth.
Joe DiMaggio's.
Okay. Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak is certainly one of them. Well, DiMaggio never had to face Bullet Joe Rogan or Willie Foster or Satchel Paige when he hit for 56 games in a row. I can't answer your question. It would have been a hell of a game.
Just a comment, I remember when the Pirates fielded an all black Latino team, there was a lot of negative comment in the neighborhoods about that, and some people were claiming we're boycotting. just because of that.
Mhm.
Disgusting.
You know, I think there was some, Dave Parker, who becomes, you know, one of the highest paid ball players, you know, he was out there, larger than life, African American. He took a lot of abuse. I think in some ways they drove him out of Pittsburgh. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to romanticize this story. But I do think that, you know, this multiracial nature of the teams of the 70s is critical to the identity. And I think they model behavior which I think affects particularly children. Yes?
Is there any evidence that Barney Dreyfuss or Ben Swanger had any interest in black ball players or tried in any way to bring them in?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's this, nothing with Dreyfuss. Although Dreyfuss and Ben Swanger would rent out Forbes Field to the black clubs. There is a story that was written about in the Pittsburgh Courier that, this was in the late 30s, that William Ben Swanger was Barney Dreyfuss's son-in-law. Dreyfuss dies in 33. And Ellen and Bill Ben Swanger run the club until they sell in 46. That they were going to give a tryout to black players. And there seemed to be a reaction from some of the other white owners, and if it was a real possibility, it didn't happen. You know, Major League Baseball touts Robinson as their greatest figure. But when Robinson was signed, and they had a meeting of the 16 Major League owners to approve his contract, the vote was 15-1 against approving his contract. And it's only because the new commissioner, Happy Chambers, former senator from Kentucky, approved it that Robinson was able to come into the majors. These guys were fearful that if you have black fans, they're going to scare the white fans away. And ironically, some of these white owners were renting their ball club to the black teams, like the Yankees and the Washington Senators, and making good money. The Homestead Grays would play 3 games a week in Washington Stadium at Griffith Park from the late 30s through World War II. And they didn't want to lose that revenue.
Since it was the press that could give you all the information, how was it done? There was the Pittsburgh Press and Post-Gazette and the Sun-Telegraph. Were they very active in letting the people know what was going on?
Well, you know, you'd be amazed at how much coverage of Negro League and independent sport there was. But the really great source for me when I was doing this dissertation was the Pittsburgh Courier.
Yes, but that's an African-American newspaper.
Sure. But it was great coverage. And you know, fortunately, when I started this, a lot of people were still alive who had played for these teams. And you could go and find them. And they tell you their story. Not a whole lot of business records survived, but memories, newspaper articles and the like.
Also, where they played the games, I guess people came to watch. Was it mostly African American?
No.
Did a lot of white people come too?
I've talked to many people. Remember the Hill was integrated.
I know, I lived there.
Okay. So, people, you know, white people went up to Greenleaf Field. White people saw them at Forbes Field. Art Rooney would never miss a Homestead Grays game. Cum Posey was his mentor. When Art was in prep school at Duquesne University, prep, Cum Posey's in university, and Art modeled himself after Cum Posey. The Grays and the Crawfords might play 300 baseball games a year. 50 or 60 were against Negro League teams. The others were against white and black independent clubs. And they play far more games against white teams in areas where they were the only black people in town. They'd go play in a coal mining area, and the minors would take off for the afternoon. They'd play, their team against the Grays, and then they'd have a picnic for them afterwards. So yeah, a lot of weights, so.
John, basketball and football are part of the reason for the drop in participation. Are there others?
Yeah, I think the initial reason is that if you look at the first generation of black ball players who come into the majors, they learned how to play baseball in the Negro Leagues. They grew up playing for black neighborhood teams. Well, when the Negro Leagues no longer exist, and the sandlot clubs are being destroyed by television and suburbanization, black kids who want to grow up and play baseball, learn the game, have to go into the minor leagues. The minor leagues are in the South. Not a happy story. Meanwhile, Major League Baseball increasingly gets its players from the colleges. Only a couple of years ago, only 4.5% of all NCAA scholarship baseball players were African American. 10 times that many in football and basketball. The reason is this: those college baseball scholarships are only partial scholarships. They're not a full ride. So if you need that scholarship to get the education, you're going to play basketball or football instead of baseball. Secondly, I don't know if any of you have kids who played Little League lately, but after Little League, if you want to keep playing baseball, you have to join a travel team. That can cost you $3,000 or $4,000. Plus, we've seen across the board, white and black, but more so in black than white families, a decline in the two-headed household. And you don't have the fathers to teach the sons the love and the lure of the game. Meanwhile, you can develop your football and basketball skills in high school, which really are, baseball in high school isn't much, which is a summer game, or in the AAU. So it's a combination of those reasons. And then in the 50s, these are not necessarily in order, when colleges opened up scholarships in basketball and football, you can get an education. And anybody's going to take that college scholarship over a minor league career where the money was terrible and the future was uncertain. If you could get that scholarship, you'd take that. So I think it's a combination of reasons. And then it just becomes, a life of its own. Everybody wants to be like Mike. And they want to be like Michael Jordan. They want to be in the NFL. And Major League Baseball has done one thing which is interesting. They've begun to throw resources to a program called RBI, Rebuilding Baseball in the Inner City, which is started by a former scout, African American from Compton in LA, who was trying to rebuild the fabric of his community and get more black kids into baseball. Sean Gibson, Josh Gibson's great-grandson, runs the Josh Gibson Foundation, which has some RBI clubs in Pittsburgh. A couple of years ago, 2009 World Series began with CC Sabathia for the Yankees, pitching to Jimmy Rollins of the Phillies. Only the second time in Major League history the World Series began with a black pitcher and a black batter. Both of those guys have played for RBI. So they're sort of rebuilding.
When was RBI set up?
When?
Yeah, is it?
I think it began a little over 20 years ago. Late
Did it
80s.
get Darryl Strawberry?
No.
It didn't come through. Other questions?
I'm thinking of things like, in terms of change, I'm thinking football, hockey, television, violence. It seems to be appealing in terms of smashing, knocking down, hitting, and that brings in more revenue for the TV companies that are broadcasting.
Well, there's no question that certain sports, whether they'll admit it or not, promote violence as a means to sell. Hockey and football are pretty good examples.
I don't know about basketball though, it's not quite, but it's very aggressive.
It's a much more physical game, particularly in the Big East.
A couple other questions.
Intelligence feeds into that.
Toby?
You mentioned the great coverage in the Courier. They have great reporters. I have some experiences with Frank Bolden, for example. What a wonderful man. Were there any great baseball writers in the Courier? People who could be Hall of Fame type?
Yeah. Well, there is one, Wendell Smith, who is in the Hall of Fame, who Branch Rickey hired to school Jackie Robinson in his first year in the majors and lived with them on the road when there wasn't anybody else to live with them. In early years, Rollo Wilson, Ches Washington, Rick Roberts, were all first-class sports writers. Some of you know of Bill Nunn. There are three Bill Nunns. One was, the first was the managing editor of the Courier and the sports writer, and he played for the Grays. The second, Bill Nunn Jr., is the guy who brought a lot of the great black ball players from small colleges to the Steelers in the 70s. And the third Bill Nunn is an actor. But the Nunns were also, Bill Nunn, the first two Nunns were big sports writers.
Teenie Harris has photographed a great many of the players. It's just a show his pictures. He's just leaving now. But didn't Rooney have a team, Sandler team, Rooney Reds?
Mm-hmm.
He played in Sandler games against the Homestead Grays.
Right. I have a bunch of box scores where Rooney's teams played the Grays. Art Rooney loved baseball far more than football. That was his game. And if it wasn't for an injury he suffered a season when he quarterbacked both the Indiana State Normal and the Duquesne University teams in the same season, he probably would have made it in the majors. He was a high minor leaguer. And he constantly was playing. Rooney used to bankroll the Homestead Grays to get to spring training until they generated the cash flow. Teenie Harris, by the way, was on the original Crawfords, and he's in that photo of these kids when they're on the steps of Carnegie Library, and then he stopped playing within a couple of years.
Did he ever own one of those two teams?
No.
Is there anything left around Pittsburgh of the CM lot and the semi-pro teams?
You know, there are some leagues. I think it's called the Federation League or the Greater Pittsburgh League. And they've lasted. But nothing, if you were to go back and look in a newspaper in the 20s or the 30s, you would just see an amazing number of teams and players. Guys would play into their 40s. You know, we were much more of a participant than a spectating sports nation in those days.
It just wasn't Pittsburgh.
Right. Any big city, any city, but even in small towns. You know, that's what people did. They didn't have television. It was fun to play.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
We'll see you on Marcellus Shale next month. Change your caps before you come.